So I'm Bruce Taylor from Data Center Dynamics, and I want to welcome you and acknowledge you for all being here today on, many of you on short notice, I know. This is maybe one of the most important conversations for the data center industry and the energy industry to be having. We intend to make this a worldwide conversation. We start here, we'll move it to Dallas, it then goes to Amsterdam. We haven't set the schedule for the rest. So you're really at the very beginning. You are the sausage. So thank you.
So you are the walrus?
So I want to acknowledge first the two companies who stepped up and were willing to help sponsor the day. Hydro-Québec. David Murray is here from Hydro-Québec. David, stand up so people can acknowledge you. Hydro-Québec. Canada's largest utility and certainly a forerunner in everything they're doing, and we're delighted that they are here with us. OSIsoft, are they in the room, or are they still in the infrastructure masons? Thank you, thank you. So OSIsoft, if you don't know, one of the all-time iconic companies in the business of data analytics for power management and for operational intelligence. And I'm very delighted that they are here with us. I did make notes, just so that you know. The co-chairs for this have put in a lot of time with me in the planning, and I want to acknowledge them, specifically Peter Gross, head of the data center practice at Bloom Energy, one of the, again, one of the all-time iconic data center designers in the world. Dr. Mukesh Khattar, is he here, or is he in the infrastructure masons meeting still? I think hasn't made it through yet. Susanna Kass, who's sitting right here with me, who is Chief of Innovation and Sustainability for Base Layer. Thank you. Mark Mills, who's a Senior Fellow with the Manhattan Institute and one of the all-time experts in the field of energy. And Dr. Julie Albright from the University of Southern California, a digital sociologist, and a whole hell of a lot more, trust me. That, for those who don't know me, is my idea of a bio, because you can look these people up online. You really can. So I wanted to tell you just a little bit about how this afternoon is going to go, and we're going to run a little bit. Mukesh, you're here. Thank you. We just acknowledged you, and you weren't here to receive acknowledgement. So the idea behind this day is that everybody in this room is a peer. Nobody has any greater value. No one has an opinion that is any greater than anyone else's opinion. If you're in the audience, you could easily be on a round table, and we know that. So this is participatory. It is as open mic as we can make it. We want to start at these large panels, the round tables, the semicircular tables, and then move it out into the audience. However, it is up to the moderator of each roundtable to determine when it goes to the audience. And if you have something that's burning and you want to stand up and say it, we'll get a mic to you and stand up and say it. I ask that all comments be as succinct as possible. We are short on time. This isn't a time for long speeches. It's a time to interact with people and be in conversation. So when you do comment, please keep in mind it's to further that conversation, not limit it or stop it. So we're going to start today saying just a little bit more about Julie Albright from a personal perspective. Those who have watched data center dynamics conferences over the last couple of years know that I start each conference with something that is outside the edge of the data center, something that is edgy. 2 years ago, it was IBM Watson ecosystem. We also had Robert Scoble on AR and VR. And we've had other notables over time. On a whim, I convinced Julie via Facebook, thank you, that we had an audience that needed to hear her message. And she generously came and spoke in New York in March when we had a blizzard and only half of the audience showed up. But I will tell you, that room was deeply impacted. And one of our great friends in the data center industry, a name you all know from a company you all know, came up to me while she was still talking and said, "This is the best keynote I have heard in a tech conference in 5 years, maybe more." And it's because she talks about digital transformation from the perspective of what's driving it. Not how do we manage it from an infrastructure standpoint, but what's behind it, what culturally is changing, what societally is changing or has changed. And it's quite compelling. And you'll hear her tomorrow morning if you stay, because she is part of the keynote package in the morning for the beginning of Webscale. So Julie, thank you for again being willing to be with us. By the way, she arrived in San Francisco yesterday needing root canal surgery on an emergency basis. She checks into the hotel after root canal, and they put her in a room with no air conditioning. And she forgot her narcotics. I don't know how she forgot that at the pharmacy. So she spent a painful, uncomfortable night, and the fact that she is with us is a testament to her fortitude, for sure.
I'm a warrior.
So again, if I tried to say who Mark Mills is in the world of energy and tech, I would fail. Senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, a regular contributor to Forbes, recently a contributor to Fortune, a book author, widely respected, highly regarded, and it is an honor to have him here. And she is going to, excuse me, Mark.
It's okay, it's the 21st century.
It's 21st century.
You never know.
He's going to start off with a positioning statement for us today that we hope sparks some interest. And following that, he is going to lead the fire starters, the people who are around him on either side. We're waiting from Dean Nelson from Uber Compute to join us from the Infrastructure Masons meeting, where he's hung up, but we'll get started in any case. So Mark Mills, I'm turning it over to you.
Thanks, Bruce, and thanks for the kind remarks. And thank you for coming, by the way, with your narcotic-free, painful night.
If I say anything weird, you'll know why.
Exactly. So Bruce gave me the charge of, I'm always hesitant of the word when he said fire starter, because that may imply something about my perspective on some things. But and he wanted me to sort of spark things briefly, and he said sort of 5 to 8 minute time frame. So I will, in order to adhere to that and not spend too long, let me tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to spend about 8 minutes, maybe slightly less, covering 5 numbers. So thinking about how to spark the thinking here, let me propose the framework for the future of the intersection of the two worlds, which is the data universe and the utility universe. The key metric that matters, that has brought this into play, is is quantity, right? It's the quantity of electricity consumed by the data ecosystem. If it were trivial, if it were 1950, this meeting wouldn't be taking place. So it's at the first order, it's all about quantity. And there, you know the apocryphal statement that quantity has a quality all of its own, incorrectly attributed to Stalin. No one knows where it came from, but it has a nice ring to it. But quantity does have a quality of all of its own. So let me propose for you a way to think about the quantity of electricity that data ecosystem is likely to, and in my opinion, almost certainly going to entail in the coming decades. The 5 numbers that will help you to context this. The first number is 1 billion, right? A billion. Well, in the first 50 years of the computing era, which is roughly 1955 to 2005, the number of computations per kilowatt hour improved by 1 billion-fold. It's a pretty significant piece of engineering work. It's why there's so many data centers in the world and so much computing going on. That's the single physics and engineering reason. If you hadn't accomplished that, there would still be, in the words of, remember IBM saying there'd only be 1 or 2 computers in the world, there'd still only be 1 or 2 computers in the world. An enterprise-class data center operating at 1980 energy efficiency would consume more power than the city of Manhattan. So the proliferation of computing in data centers is a direct result of this astonishing improvement in the engineering efficiency of computation. The second number is the number 2. I'm going to cheat on 2 by giving you a trifecta of 2s, but very briefly. The share of the US GDP, and this is reflected around the developed world, the share of the US GDP associated with moving bits is now twice as big as the share of the US GDP associated with moving things. And the latter is growing slower than the former, as you know. That has led to a phenomena that Greenpeace likes to point out every year now, but just to use their number, that means that today, as best we can account for it, the quantity of electricity used by the data ecosystem globally is twice as big, number 2 again, as all of Japan's electricity consumption for all purposes. It's a significant number. And what's going on today is that in the mature economies, the growth rate and demand for electricity associated with data is growing at twice the rate of the growth rate and demand for electricity associated with everything else. The third number in my group of 5 is 5. And this is the one that most people focus on. It's an important number, but I'll explain to you why it's a misleading number. In the information world, I just told you that twice as much of the economy is associated with information, moving bits, as moving stuff. Well, only 5% as much energy is associated with $1 of GDP in the information economy as in the transportation economy. Sounds unsurprising, but that's about what the number is. But in the arithmetic of compound averages, if one is growing at twice the rate of the other, you know what that means over time. The fourth number is the number 100. This is, to me, where it gets interesting. The first 50 years of computing, I would argue, was 1955 to 2005. Something interesting happened in 2005 for those of you who, like me, spent some time, I did in my early career, in engineering microprocessors. That was my first job, was designing LSI. So I've been sort of branded like a duckling at birth. That's sort of what I am fascinated by for forever. Well, from 2005 to 2015, the last decade, roughly, the improvement in computational energy efficiency, computations per kilowatt hour, improved by 100-fold less than the improvement in computational energy efficiency in the last decade of the first era of computing, from 1995 to 2005. I think all of you probably have some math skills. You probably know what that means. When you come to my fifth and last number, which is 1,000. 1,000-fold increase in the scale of data in transport and storage and use is what's coming next. So Cisco says we're in the zettabyte era. We obviously are, as all of us know, in this room. And people talk a lot about forecasting the increase in data stored and transported and manipulated in the coming decades. And most of the forecasts look at increases of scale, that Amazon gets bigger. We do more of the same things we're doing today, and you get scaling of 2, 3, 4, 5-fold increase in the zettabyte era. Let me suggest to you what's going to happen in the next second era of computing. It's going to go up 1,000-fold, 3 orders of magnitude, not 1. This is, and the reason is really easy to figure out. Let me just finish by giving you the sort of the phenomenological reasons it will increase. So rather than forecasting how much bigger AWS can get or how many more movies can be streamed, we can do those forecasts trivially. We actually have very good pricing elasticities on these things now, but none of them speak to the phenomenology changes. So let me sort of sketch out a handful of phenomenology changes, each of which has embedded in it orders of magnitude more data being created, stored, processed, and moved. The first one, obviously, is going from pixels to voxels. True immersive visual reality, auto-stereoscopic 3D is, as a physicist, I'll just say it doesn't violate laws of physics, it's just difficult engineering. The engineering is clearly in sight. Pixels of voxels is a cubic function. These have become big numbers, and as you add resolution to that, you get petabytes and then exabytes, and even zettabytes of data associated with the visual media. That's a phenomenology change. It's not just moving movies, it's moving immersive reality. The other phenomenology change we have is a network function change. So we typically call it the Internet of Things. I think that's a misnomer, but let's just, and I'll explain why it's a misnomer, but if you just think about what networks have done to scale over modern history, the biggest scaling in networks was the scaling from telegraphy to telephony. That was several orders of magnitude. Telephony to smartphones was chump change by comparison. I mean, it was a lot. We went from 1 billion phones to, landline phones to billions of disconnected phones that have computing function. But as a network function, it wasn't as big as going from telegraphy to telephony. Going from connecting people to connecting things has a scaling function bigger than going from telegraphy to telephony. And when you add to that what's being networked, the scales are truly enormous, and it's not just things we'll connect, as you all know. We'll increasingly connect plants, systems of systems, biological stuff, which is sort of awkward to call our organs things, but with the advent of transient computing, organic computers, biocompatible, implantable computing systems and sensors, the scale of stuff that will fall into networks and the amount of data associated with that is several orders of magnitude beyond anything that's in play today. The second and last sort of phenomenology change, of course, is the movement from the cyber world to the cyber-physical world. All engineers know that we've been working primarily in cyberspace. That is, we have information systems informing people about how to deal with physical things. The true connection between cyber and physical is rare, auto-flying and aircrafts, of course. But the true cyber-physical connectivity is very difficult. But once you do that, and you can only do that by having astonishing quantities of data that allow you to mediate those two worlds, whether it's 3D printing, self-driving cars, biological systems, all of these things. Once you bolt the two worlds together, if you dig one layer down into the interstices of how you do it, you find astronomical quantities of data. And the last one, which relates to that, is the migration, which is essentially inevitable but very difficult to engineer, from petascale to exascale computing. You all know what that is. That gets you your 3 orders of magnitude. Why would exascale computing matter? Well, it matters because we want to simulate everything. We want to simulate all mechanical things, from aircraft to cars to data centers themselves. We want to simulate biological functions. We want to simulate how cells operate, how organs and proteins work. We want to simulate everything because it allows us to learn things. It also allows us to improve things and control things. Well, what we know today is that petascale computers can simulate reality. We can simulate systems. We can simulate a helicopter. We can simulate actually a 3D printer operating at the ray tracing level with powders. The problem is to simulate 1 minute of 3D printing takes 1 month on a supercomputer at Lawrence Livermore. To simulate 1 minute of flying in a Sikorsky takes 40 days on a supercomputer. They have their own cray. If I go to exascale computing, I'll simulate everything. You can, again, I'll end with, you could, as they say, you can do the math. Once simulation and exascale becomes ubiquitous, it will. in time. It may take a decade or two. Then the quantities of data involved are truly astronomical. So the two numbers that I began with, we have a 1,000-fold increase in data coming, and data being created, stored, and processed in the foreseeable future against Moore's law not ending but getting tired in terms of energy scaling. It's a very interesting intersection. So I'll end with what Vint Cerf said last year in an interesting piece in the Computing magazine for IEEE. He was talking about the criticality and reliability of systems for the world. And he said, and I'll paraphrase, but I can send you the link to his quote, that our dependence on information systems is very high in modern society. Our dependence on electrical systems is higher. The two worlds are intersecting already. My proposition is that whatever we think about those intersections and their challenges in terms of the two different regulatory spheres, two political spheres, whatever the challenges are today, they're going to become far more interesting and far more severe in the future.
So Mark, thank you very much. That was a great way to start this. I don't remember any of it, so I'll have to see it online when we publish it. So you're now in the fire starter section. So now it is up to you to take this the next step. Dean Nelson has joined you. You've got a great panel up there. I want to limit the fire starters to not more than 10 minutes. Originally it was 20. We're going to buy back some time. So take it away. Mark Mills.
Well, I think I put a lot of numbers out deliberately, but we have a panel full of experts all across these domains. I want to start with Paula on this question of demand, because once I move this scale, set the physics of energy aside, is there anything that I'm saying behaviorally in terms of how humans think about what they get out of the utility of data systems that would ring incorrectly?
Do you want me to answer that?
I do.
Julie? Oh, okay. No, not necessarily ring incorrectly, but I think that I was going to talk a little bit about that. I think that, if you think about this as a Venn diagram, that's the way I've been thinking about that, where we have the energy sector coming together with the data center sector. And, that sort of intersection, I think things are changing. And you hinted at some of that with the Internet of Things, how, as we have more and more things connected, the reason Don and I started working together, Don's right here at my right, is we wrote a big grant around the smart grid. And people say, well, David Strela just said this to me, how did you get involved with data centers? But when we started working around smart grid, suddenly you have data and energy connected to consumers, via smartphones or via, all sorts of devices. And as those devices intensify, you have a closer, in my view, closer relationship of the consumer with the energy sector and with the data center sector, of course. So, I'll talk again tomorrow about a framework for that. But to me, behavior and technology are intertwined and both inform one another now. So I don't think you'll be able to ever disentwine those two things again. Technology informs and shapes behavior, and behavior also shapes technologies.
Well, to that end, let me put a notional fact out that I did during the World Series. I was pointing out that given current network efficiencies, those millennials that were watching the World Series on smartphones were using roughly the same amount of energy in the system and the network as driving 20 miles in a Prius to get to the games to watch them. And most of the millennials view that device as free, both economically, because it has a marginal cost, but I know from my own experience of lecturing in universities that they think it's actually free of the overhead in the energy ecosystem.
Yes, that's right. Dean Nelson had said if millennials realized how much those pictures on Instagram of their lunch cost in terms of energy and data, they probably wouldn't post as many pictures. Remember you were talking about that? It's true.
So Leanne, I'd like to ask you if you'd chime in now and talk about this from a utilities perspective. What you just heard, what comes to mind? What rises up for you?
The utility sector, especially on the distribution side, is going through revolutionary change. There was for decades such a focus on our transmission systems. And now really the change has moved to the focus on the distribution system and how we're serving and integrating our customers. And data centers, I think, have always posed a somewhat of a difficult position for the utilities. I know that we hear quite a bit about power quality on the distribution system. But now with the environment changing so much and with such a focus on integrating distributed energy resources and the need to really have the smart grid of the future, which smart grid can be used in so many different ways, but how we're going to serve our customers and our sensitive customers around data and be able to do so with renewable resources, but yet not maintain power quality, but improve power quality and improve reliability. These are all fascinating challenges. It makes it a very exciting time to be in the utility industry. I think a few decades ago, it was the, nice, well, it was a secure future. Very predictable. Yeah. And now that environment has completely changed. And completely changed as well as having a conversation earlier with regard to millennials. Not only are they using all of this data, which is changing the way we think about data, but they're also our employees. And we had utility folks that had been around for decades, and we've seen, depending on the utility, we've seen different bubbles of the retirement bubble. We happen in Southern California, Edison, we happen to see the retirement bubble on the distribution side quite a while ago, about 15 years ago, which means now all of our employees are these millennials. And it introduces very interesting challenges. Wonderful, think outside of the box, great different ways to think about the distribution system and how we serve our customers. Also challenging because they don't necessarily understand the field aspects and they don't have the history and the knowledge, and so having to create that in that environment as well. So lots of change. I say frequently the only constant is change, but I think we have to, in the Venn diagram, I actually drew a little Venn diagram on my paper here, because we have to find ways to partner and come together and learn how to serve and support each other. I think if utilities were to just go about this on our own and say, here, take our energy or leave it, we aren't going to be successful. And yet at the same time, we know that it takes increasing amounts of energy in order to serve all of this data in the future. So I think we do have to develop a partnership and find ways to support each other.
So from a data center operator perspective, who on the panel wants to take it the next step? Reacted to what she did, please. David.
Yeah, So if I can add to the comments, so obviously data is critical for utilities to understand the balancing of the network. So if you're looking, typically, it's a push system. You're going from the energy to the customers. Now everything is really changing. When you have, you're producing, 47,000 megawatts of power, when you have 70,000 miles of network, and you have push that's coming in for energy, and you also have a pull from, the customer base, you want to have reliability of your network and the balancing act with the SCADAs and the system and the data to understand, where are you going to invest on your next line is going to be critical, because at the end, it's all the consumers that will pay if we're making the wrong choices. So for me, all this merge of data and energy is so key, because we need to understand that transition. And it's all a question of the speed of the transition. Everybody believes that we're going. Companies are putting solar roofs. Everybody's getting into this, software control in their house and everything. So how can you balance all this at the lowest cost for everybody and for data centers also at the same time?
Please, go ahead.
Yeah, and if I could say, I think it's the challenge of two very different industry approaches. You have an entrepreneurial, fast-moving approach versus a blue chip, older approach to the network grids. And somebody, I forget where I heard it, but it was essentially if You lose internet, you go back to the 1980s. If you lose electricity, you go back to the 1880s. So it's extremely critical, and the merging of those two, and you're not going to slow down the entrepreneurial aspect of data centers and the convergence of all these technologies. And as Mark mentioned, as more and more of these Internet of Things come online, healthcare and everything else, self-driving cars and all that, you're not going to slow that down. So the importance of quickly or more quickly bringing these additional abilities onto the electrical grid, I think, is extremely important.
If I may add, if you look at the relationship between power and data centers, since this is a data center conference, there are three things that really matter. One is reliability or resiliency. Number two would be probably sustainability. Number three, probably the most important, would be total cost of ownership. And then efficiency is a subset of both TCO and sustainability. So historically, there was always a buffer between the utility and the server. We had this very complex infrastructure support system consisting of UPSs and generators and switchgear and transfer switches. Very complex, very expensive, but historically that was the typical architecture, simply because resilience and reliability was the single most important element that drove pretty much every decision in the design and operation of the data centers. Now, fast forward 2017, it's a different world, and primarily is driven by cloud, by different linked modes of operation. Don't get me wrong, the reliability of the single entity, single data center remains very important, but this new architecture, primarily driven by cloud, has created this concept of distributed resiliency, where reliability is not necessarily all relying on individual data centers, and now we have a bunch of different models that are completely changing the topology, the configuration of the critical support infrastructure. I'm talking specifically about power. And if you look at OCP, to a lesser extent, Open19, if you look at concepts such as software-defined power, virtualized power, all these things are, and by the way, the importance of the utility is by no means diminished. Take, for example, OCP, where now there is no buffer between the server and the utility. The primary power goes straight from 480 volts through a distribution panel straight into the A cord of the server. So that will change the configuration and the whole philosophy of designing and operating data centers vis-a-vis the utility dramatically.
Dean, go ahead, please. Dean Nelson.
Hey. So first off, apologize for being late. We had this little meeting with a bunch of my peers in the industry that was for 3 hours this morning. And we're talking about interesting things like this. But let me get to a couple facts I believe that we might want to balance on. First is Dr. Albright. She talks about human behavior quite a bit, and its intertwined version of how technology is now tied. And I think the key here is that we're not going to change human behavior. Human behavior is going to drive the business, and it's going to drive all the capacity and infrastructure we got to build. So I'm looking at my daughter and her consumption of these things, and the data she's generating, right? It's just one of, whatever, 3, 4, 5 billion. And that multiplier to what you were talking about is going to continue. So no matter what, this exabyte and zettabyte, right? Zettabyte, we didn't even think was going to be possible before. Now it's actually on the horizon for real. And what's driving that, of course, is the behavioral aspect of it first. Because guess what? Everybody's addicted. Everybody wants more. And it's going to continue. The second one is that on the utility aspect, you look at the cloud providers, you look at independent companies. I work at Uber during the day, right? And the demand curve from us, then you think of Airbnb and all the other disruptive type of solutions out there. What are they doing? Serving that human change and that demand, that insatiable need for it, which is generating huge amounts of data, which is generating huge amounts of compute power behind it, which is now translated into more and more capacity in the infrastructure. By the way, we all have really good careers right now. This is not going to stop. It was a really good place to be. But the point is, I've been in this industry about 28 years, I've never seen this pace of growth. And one thing I want to say, though, you're one of the utilities, correct? Great. We're your best customer. Would you like to know why? We're consistent. We're a consistent base load of demand, right? Versus all the cycling things and all the residentials and everything else. So, and that demand will continue to increase, which would help stabilize the underlying demand for the grid. But the unprecedented growth I'm talking about, so you look at just the cloud players. I talk to them individually, right, as peers, and I'm seeing anywhere from 10 to 40 megawatts a month of new construction, just each individual one. And why is that happening? Whether it's the blue chip, they're all going into cloud, or whether it's the on-prem, people like the hyperscale type things that are growing all those, that's not going to stop either. So last point for me in this is, I don't believe that the world understands this industry. I don't believe they understand the criticality of this industry. We're not regulated. We're going to be regulated at some point when there's another catastrophic that happens. Just to remind you of a couple of them, just 2 weeks ago, British Airways went down for how long? Why? Because they had a power issue in the data center. And then their failover would not work. And so you think about the 100 million pounds, I think, of impact to their business alone. So whether it's the grid staying up or whether it's the infrastructure that's being powered by the grid staying up, this is mission critical. The world doesn't get it yet, right? They all use it.
Gary Demasi.
Yeah, I'd like to address, I think, the utility question because when I first started in this business many years ago, we were concerned about the growth of search and Gmail and all of the amazing things that we use every day. But I will say the emergence of the cloud in the last 5 years basically has made that pale in comparison in terms of the amount of growth I think that we see collectively ahead of us. And we have always sort of locked horns with the utilities going back 10 years when we first went to a major utility in the Midwest and said, hey, we want to buy renewable energy. And they said, no way. And so we, over the last several years, have really tried to challenge that utility model. And as data centers proliferate, as the load increases, we've talked a lot about that already today, we really need to continue to challenge that model. And I think a key component is the sustainability component. Utilities today are not structured to deliver us the product that we want. And we've really got to challenge that. We've been successful, but it's been a very rocky road. And we've had to do a lot of what I would consider to be unnatural things. And it's really sort of battling the regulatory frameworks that don't work for us, the rate structures, the utilities for whom this business model doesn't work. It's a real challenge, and it doesn't go away. And we've had to build energy expertise within our organization. And it's really something that the utilities and the data center operators need to come together on, or we will not be successful in solving that problem.
That's one of the big takeaways of the day, as far as I'm concerned. Thank you. Priscilla Johnson, you and I talked about the regulatory nature of the utilities just a little while ago, so please step in here.
Sure. Priscilla Johnson, PG&E. My expertise is actually in energy efficiency, so I always talk about it from the framework of the first loading order, at least here in California, which is energy efficiency, and the dire need for energy efficiency to be married with demand response. As of now, it is not very clear that that is happening on a grand scale in California. There's several reasons for that. But suffice it to say, I think that the hidden opportunities for energy efficiency as the first loading order are what isn't really discussed. I spent the last few years working very closely with Dr. Khattar, Mukesh, as well as others in this room, examining the space of embedded data centers and what those numbers could bring in terms of scale. Mark Mills, talk about scale. We really don't talk about those telecom rooms across the hall from the bathrooms and what's really running on those servers. Has anybody even really opened the door and dusted them off and found out what apps are running? And I have a really kind of funny story. The building I work in, it's just a few blocks down from here, and the lights went off on my floor. And it happened on a weekend, and you came back Monday, and that's the only way you really knew what was running on those servers, because some of the applications weren't working. So having clarity on what the power consumption is in those hidden spaces, multiplying that across a city, a state, a country, a globe, I think is where the utilities, at least from the energy efficiency standpoint, can contribute. And we've done some initial work on that, and we'd like to do more.
So, Don Paul, we haven't heard from you yet.
Yeah,
You
I
have
think
to have a
there's
comment.
just a couple of points I thought very interesting from the discussion so far. One, when you talk about reliability, these days you have to connect it to another major intersection of energy and the digital world, which is around cyber and cyber physical security. And the explosion in the digital world, in my view, the insecurity grows along with the digital scale. And so one of the questions one would ask is, as you expand this base and as you distribute intelligence into the network where the dominant communication network won't be people anymore, it'll be the machines computing. How is this all going to play out? Because I honestly don't believe we have any kind of real grip on this problem. So that's one question. The other one that I thought was very interesting is this idea that people are underestimating the digital growth rate and will it impact ultimately the energy demand and therefore the energy supply structure. Over the last several years, basically, energy demand in the advanced economy is basically flat. Okay. Now, what's happened, as was pointed out, is we've switched. We've substituted consumption of energy for digits in the digital economy for the physical use. In other words, we've consumed our efficiency gains, just like we always have. There's one of the challenges I have about when people talk, when in my early life before I came to USC, I was the CTO at Chevron. And we spent a lot of time talking about energy efficiency. And one of the history shows that people, as economies and civilization advances, they consume their efficiency gains. So this idea that you're actually going to continue to plunge down and use less and less and less, ultimately, I think you have to say, well, maybe that's not true. Maybe this recent episode of softening or flattening demand is actually just a hiatus, and that unless the efficiency per byte continues to have dramatic changes, as was pointed out, maybe that's not the way it's going to actually go. And if you, most people, I heard the 1000x, which I would agree with, but a lot of people, I think, that in their energy planning, they aren't thinking 1000x. They may be thinking 10x for sure, but maybe 100x. But if you really have that kind of explosion, you have to wonder whether you'll have enough efficiency gains. And if you don't, then your energy demand is going to rise. And I think that is a very, that's not anybody's forecast for the advanced economies, by the way. There's a lot of energy demand in the world, about 50%, but all of it's in the developing economies. But this question says, are the digital economies actually going to reverse this? What have we been on an efficiency gain and demand reduction for better part of 30 to 40 years? And the question is that going to reverse, taken up by this? And I would just throw that out there. I think it's a very interesting thing. And then one other point, talked about the cycle time differences. And I think this is a really important question from a systems point of view. If you hook two systems together, and one of them's got a cycle time of 50 years, and the other one's got a cycle time of 5 years, which is the capital thing, funny things can happen to the system. And I think we're seeing this, and the energy investments are intrinsically generational in length, or you can never make them pay for themselves. But the digital world, which is wrapped around that now, like 2 strands of DNA, it's cycling around at 10 times the rate. And what will that do?
Adam Kramer, switch.
Well, I want to jump off of your comment, right, about the advanced economy, the load demand is essentially staying flat, and talk about the digital economy. So in 2016, in our rate class in Las Vegas in Nevada, that Switch is part of, we accounted for the entire growth of the rate class, which was a 1% growth inside of the large rate class that includes a lot of casinos. Switch was the entire growth. So it's exactly to your point.
2016.
What?
In 2016.
In 2016.
What were you seeing the years before that?
It was less, but it's continued to incrementally grow as, of course, we've grown, and Dean deploys 50 kW server racks now. But to that point, and to build off of what the demand and what the need is for the utility and how to work with the digital economy, I think it's pretty simple, right? I think it comes down to 2 things. First is physical delivery of the power. We procure the physical delivery very differently than most people, right? We're prepared for capacity. So when we sit down with the utility, we're like, we need 100 megawatts of capacity. They're like, whoa, you're using 100 megawatts of power? No, calm down. Everyone's excited. No, we're using 100 megawatts of capacity because we're going to grow into that, right? As people are refreshing their equipment, we're going to need to have the capacity on hand to handle that and to support the continued load growth. And that in and of itself is a paradigm shift, and most of the time we sit down with utilities to have that conversation when we need to deliver that capacity day one, to have that existing. The other thing, of course, is tariffs, right? Is creating tariffs that actually reflect what's going on with the data center side. We created the first high load factor tariff in Nevada, right? To the point, we are 90% load factor. That's awesome. It's great because we're consuming the same power at 2 a.m. as we are at 2 p.m. And we need to make sure that the data center industry and as a whole is getting credit for that, because that is delivering a benefit to the entire system, but it also should be a benefit to help encourage and support the growth of what's going on. And I won't forget, I was at NARUC last year, and there was a comment. They were talking with all these public service commissioners, public utility commissioners around the country, and one of the commissioners from Iowa, which I think was the state you probably were referencing earlier, she made a comment. She says, my job is really an economic development commissioner, not a public service commissioner. I need to make sure that I am staying proactive on promoting economic development by doing this. And that also means making sure that there are green tariffs available and that they are competitive and that we are reflecting the precipitous drop in pricing that we're seeing in green energy, which in and of itself has been a challenge to get as a pass-through from utilities. But I think that those things and that convergence is really what we're talking about today. And it's the thing that I think we're seeing some utilities become more progressive on and some that are kind of sheltering in place and hoping that the world changes around them but doesn't change them.
So Gymkhana Fern, you're the one person we haven't heard from, and I know the kinds of things you're doing, so let's hear from you.
All right, well, I come from wearing a few different hats, having been a regulator and policymaker, having been a utility executive, and now a technology executive. I want to bookend Mark, so I'm going to macro, then some micro, and then markets, so 3 M's. So first, collectively, this is an incredibly exciting time, as you can tell from the panel. And it's incredibly exciting because data centers are the foundation of the new economy. Okay, and we don't look at ourselves that way, but we are no different. If you think about most of human existence, you needed access to water to sustain life. So most of human existence was finding water and creating plumbing and creating infrastructure for water. Then with the Industrial Revolution, it was access to energy. So you needed water and energy, and with energy, you enhance life. You extend life. So you had sustaining life, energy helped to extend life. And now data, information, education, communication is what enhances life, and that's what's driving this demand. So we are at this tiny point in a long arc of where we're going as humans, and data is it. And if we don't get the plumbing right, okay, we're going to get it all wrong. And so it has to be secure, it has to be reliable, it has to be affordable. It has to be interoperable. So this is what we're about. So that's sort of the macro view. And we have to come at it from that macro view because with these growth rates that Mark described, the infrastructure has to match the speed, the sustainability, the quality, the capability. Now, at the same time, we have this clash of customers and regulatory frameworks. So first, the end customers, digital's driving products. Digital's driving biology. digital's driving technology, and then their own operations and energy use. To Don's point, we need to cannibalize efficiency in product creation, product development, services for people. We need to cannibalize that efficiency because we got to make up for it on the data delivery side. And so this is really a critical thing we have. The energy sector itself is sitting on at least a 25% energy efficiency program if we can get digital products and services into the electricity system, okay? But we can't because there's a huge market impediment to doing that at the scale and the speed that's available to us. And yet, think of a 25% energy usage reduction in the electricity system nationwide. That pays for a massive transformation in our overall economy, which means data centers. So we've seen this incredible evolution of the compute side, okay, and yet the infrastructure side, you know, is back in the Stone Age by comparison. And so, you know, the work that Switch, that Uber, that Google and others are doing to drive, to deal with just the first thin layer of sustainability, which is let's make my power, you know, low or zero emission. That's the first thin layer. We actually now have to push the data center infrastructure in its massive water consumption, in its massive energy utilization. And if you're going to use a lot of renewables, I need to use more of them more effectively at a lower cost in order to keep the renewables flowing onto the grid with reliability for people like SCE and PG&E. So how do we get there? Okay, so that's the micro thing. You have all this opportunity with the users, the producers, the providers. How do we get there? We can only get there through markets. And so if there's one big idea I want to leave for all of you, and folks here are struggling with it, we have to get to the other side in America and in the rest of the world on restructuring our electricity markets to make them market-based, which means leave the monopoly in the wires and get rid of the monopoly on everything else. Every sector that is restructured to competition, every sector, aviation, milk, telecom, I can give you every one of them. Right after they restructure to competitive markets, which are well regulated, but you're regulating competition now, not regulating production and prices and everything else, within 5 years you had ubiquity to technology transformation. How long did it take to go from landline phones to cell phones when the telecom restructured? 5 years. How long did it go from cell phones to smartphones? 5 years. Okay? When you restructure, innovation explodes. Our utilities cannot achieve that. Our regulators, I cringe when I hear the regulators are responsible for economic development. There's no regulator on earth that would have approved this product because there were at least 50 things wrong with it when it was released. Never would have cleared a regulator. So we have to get to the other side of this. Everything we talked about will happen, but it will happen a hell of a lot faster, a hell of a lot cheaper, in a much more interesting ways if we can restructure our markets.
Jim, thank you. Yeah, excellent. I think we've got our takeaway moments here. So one thing I would like to ask people to do is not turn the wands, the mic wands, toward you because they're set up to pick up everybody at the table. So just a reminder. We do have, I think we have water and refreshments in the back of the room here shortly. We don't have? Oh, never mind. Okay. So now I think it's time to bring this out into the audience. Who has a reflection on something that you have just heard or a point you think needs to be made that hasn't been made? Anyone? There you go. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce. My name's John Ford with Saby Data Centers. I always cringe a little bit when I hear people using numbers like 2% or 3% of all the electricity used, because it's like saying how many cars are on the road or how many people live in a town. There's always going to be somebody that's going to say, well, that's too many cars. That's too many people living in that town. My hope is that we can figure out how we can address, rather than we're 2 or 3% of all the electricity used in data centers, is to talk about what that's producing. And you guys have all talked about it, addressed it somewhat, but talk about how much more efficient it would be than people having servers in their homes, having, the increased, Mark, you talked about the increases in energy efficiency, and how we can change the conversation from a number, which might make us feel good because it's a big number, but to what that, how we've improved the industry and improved our efficiency.
Who else? Please. This is interactive. You've got to have an opinion. There you go. It's coming right to you.
Hello, I'm from the TND Industry, from the supplier side. And one thing, this is so amazing, this is the first time I'm attending from the point of data centers. We talk about this exponential growth and the numbers are amazing, but are the utilities aware of this? Because whatever I hear from the utility side, there are other problems like grid is broken, the transmission, especially the transmission highway is not there, so those are their concerns. Is this just a drop in the bucket in terms of demand? Is this something that's really utilities are considering in its projections? Are they aware of this phenomenal growth? And are there any numbers in terms of gigawatts or megawatts or gigawatt hours that one is taken into account, say, for the next 20 years? I don't see any such data in the Department of Energy data.
So Leanne, would you take that, please?
Sure. I think again, my focus is on our distribution system. And when we look at the distribution system and we look at the impact of data centers, absolutely, we're looking at very near-term forecasts as well as longer-term forecasts. We have absolutely seen a flattening of a growth rate overall, but I think the important distinction between transmission and distribution is that in a transmission system, you can levelize your loads, whereas on a distribution system, many of us run a radialized system, and so it becomes much more difficult. And so you do have to target all the way down to individual customers throughout your service territory. Our service territory is fairly large, 50,000 square miles. We have to look at all of the individual impacts. Not only do we have to think about the growth certainly in the data center market, we also have to think about the growth in DERs, so in who's installing solar, who's installing energy storage, what impact does that have? What impact does it have when they all have solar and we don't see that peak in the middle of the day and then a cloud comes over, yet we still need to make sure that we have that adequate capacity to serve those customers as well. So I think absolutely we are looking at that. We look very closely at all of the various layers in the system. It has provided some unique challenges given that we're operating with much, I'll say, lower margins in capacity and capability to operate. You brought up Uber and Airbnb, and we're looking in California at who is the distribution system operator of the future. We've got the ISOs on the transmission side, but what does the distribution system look like? And if we think about having, in potentially restructured markets, think about having all of these different operators, what does that look like? It gets incredibly complicated as we're trying to understand how we serve our customers with higher levels of reliability and higher levels of power quality. And I'm using them separately because I do think they are distinctly different. But yes, we absolutely have to be looking at our customers and how the efficiency gains may not then mask that future load growth.
May not matter.
Priscilla, can you comment on that as well?
Absolutely, I can. Thank you for your question. The answer from PG&E's perspective of energy efficiency is that in the proposal that they recently have submitted to the California Public Utilities Commission, high tech is the #1 opportunity for energy efficiency. So they absolutely are looking at it from that standpoint, at least in the commercial and the industrial sectors.
So who else from the audience has got a question, please?
Hey, Bruce?
Yeah.
Could I just expand a little
Yep.
bit on that? Is it okay?
Yep.
Because what's coming to mind for me is, do you guys remember John Coomey, Dr. Coomey from Stanford? He basically was engaged by, I think, the Department of Energy in 2003, 2007, I can't remember. EPA. The EPA, yes, to project the growth of data centers. And back then it was like, they're going to consume the world. And what happened was, PUE came out, and that flattened because of energy efficiency. We drove out waste in the industry a significant amount. And if you look at it, now it's commonplace to get PUEs of 1.2 and lower. within the infrastructure. So it's now just the de facto standard of how you do it. And it really goes back to what you were just saying. All those efficiency gains have been consumed. Right. And I think what you're talking about of this demand is going to continue, and it's exponentially growing because of all of these things again. So, and I look at the utility, and what you just made me think of is maybe we need utility as a service. You need a platform.
They already think they're a service.
You have a network, you have a grid, you have all these things. I'm thinking, boy, wouldn't it be amazing if we could put those into some.
But Dean, that's what a restructured market does. The utility becomes decoupled, and they are providing utility as a service, right? It's when they play the game and all the other pieces where you get all these market distortions. But to your point on the efficiency side, it's perfectly okay to have demand growth, to have to build more generation. In fact, the data centers, if we have more demand, we could actually refurbish a lot of the sagging infrastructure faster because there's more money flowing to the utilities to upgrade their systems. So there's a social benefit to some demand growth if that's what happens.
But just think
about
it.
We have a question over here that I want to get to, please.
Okay.
Got it.
Sorry, guys. Michel Chartier from Calvin Tech in Montreal. I was thinking about the teenagers or any of the 2000 and after working on an iPhone or intelligent phone, not knowing at all how much power they're drawing, and everything is free for them. And I have two teenagers, and it's true, they don't. I think someone here should invent an app that the phone will provide you how many kilowatt hour at the end of the year, how much you're consuming. I've heard numbers from 1 fridge to 2 fridge a year on a phone, overall the power you're using. So I think a tool would be worthwhile, and it would be good for all the utility people saying, okay, how much power are we using, and we create a way of either billing or using that data to provide a better service to people. Just thinking.
All that Snapchatting.
Julie, would you comment on that?
Well, yeah, this is some of the issues that we were grappling with when we did our smart grid project and I'm just going to throw this out there as a thought piece, but from the engineering side, I know a lot of you are engineers. I'm an honorary engineer at USC, but the idea that consumers are going to want to look at a line graph or a bar graph, and they just don't want to look at that. So the idea, what we were trying to do is bring in gamification, bring in, social pressures to, compete with your friends and making it fun. So the word fun and the word utility in the same sentence, that's a problem. But, sorry guys. But, that's really difficult for them to think in those terms. But that's how consumers think. So I think that, bridging that gap between the way consumers actually think and these ideas of what he's talking about is providing feedback, right, and what that form takes. So I think there's a little bit of a culture clash there between the consumer and let's say the utility side engineers in terms of how that communication might go.
Yeah. Speaking.
But I'm going to take it back to what I said earlier about it's a different type of industry, the speed, and I remember, I don't know when the brownouts were happening back in 99, 2000, 2001, and PG&E handed out the little light bulbs, and they would change color based on when you were supposed to use less energy. And those are really cool. And even recently now, I put solar on my roof, and I went and I was looking for digital displays that I could put on my wall, and I could walk in and see what's going on. The technology that is available to let people know what they're using and how to interact with their homes and their smartphones and all these things that come from the utilities are not of the same consumer grade quality. They are not intuitive, easy to use. They are not something that you would find at Best Buy. No. And so again, it's not a criticism of the industry, but it's a type of, again, from entrepreneurial, retail-based to a more commercial-based, business-to-business orientation. So I think in order to get some of these products out into the market and to get people to pay attention, they have to be more of retail-focused. You have to grab people's attention. You have to have a housewife who wants to walk in and look at the display on the wall and notice and tell her kids or that they're using too much energy, or that their charger for their phone is degrading and it's not as efficient as it was 2 months ago.
If I could just build on it, keep on this consumer interaction, which I think is at the core of a lot of the things. I mean, one is, we've driven consumers with basically flat rate plans to use as many digits as they want. I would ask the utilities a question. I know this would seem really off the wall. How about an energy system where you pay a flat fee and you can use as much as you want? What would happen? But I think this idea of the technology interface is clearly, that's clearly an example of where the industry, the energy industry, is coming from a different place than the entrepreneurial digital industry. On the other hand, the reliability expectations of the energy system, nobody, well, unless you've lived in some parts of the world, nobody would put up with an energy system that had the reliability of your cell phone. Oh, excuse me, we're going to go down for an hour.
Dropped our call.
We're going to drop power. The reliabilities of the energy system is expected to be basically nearly perfect. You don't have that expectation of any of the digital technologies. So that's the other side of that, right? So that's part of the difference between the two.
So we're about to wrap this panel, and the way I'd like to do that, and we'll start with Dave Murray, is I'd like the fire starters to put this fire out and give us your top of mind. What is the most important takeaway from this session that we all should be thinking about? Short, please, short statements.
Yep, so if I say 3 words, is really for utility time to market. That's really going to be interesting because the conversation went from different topics, from behaviors, from IoT, regulations, efficiency, new technology like LED coming, storage, microgrids, just name it. So for us to support data centers, it's going to be key to understand all the demand that's coming towards us, not only from data centers, but from consumers, and adjust to that demand, because at the end, we're going to be the gating element if we don't adjust and we don't understand all that demand that's coming towards us. So that's going to be really, really key. And from Hydro-Québec perspective, for me, I've lived in the States for a couple of years, living the Midwest and understanding. To answer, sir, your question, if we're looking into it, I can tell you right now, at Hydro-Québec, we're building the house of the future. We're putting all that technology in, from controlling your demand, understanding your consumption, from everything that exists. Your blinds are opening if the sun is coming in, and everything is very, very nice and neat. There's going to be a need to have an integrator of all these technologies for us to be focusing and understanding what are the impact of all these technologies and the impact on the network. Thank you.
Gary?
Just talking about human behavior and devices, apps, et cetera, a lot of the things that Google actually does very, very well. And so I actually think we have an opportunity for a healthy collision here of the utility world and companies and tech companies like Google and data center operators. When we talk about machine learning, artificial intelligence, things that we're spending a heck of a lot of time on, I think there are a lot of applications in the utility industry to help you along with us. Things like Nest, obviously devices in the home, all these amazing technologies that we can bring to bear. I think the two sides really need to be in this together, and I think we'll help reinvent the utility
So let me follow up just quickly. Do you think today that you have the right level of communication with your regional utilities everywhere you operate in the world?
Absolutely not.
Thank you. Okay, David, please.
Yeah, something we didn't touch too much on is the regulatory aspect. I mean, we talked about it a little bit, but again, back to my notion of speed of change. And Gary mentioned it, that in order for corporates to enter into all these new technologies, whether it's solar, wind farms, on-site, off-site, distributed products, whatever it is, there's a lot of financial gymnastics that have to go on, and they're really, really complicated, hard to execute. And then the tariffs don't line up, or you end up on some net metering product that creates financial accruals or all these, you know, challenges in other places in your business. Again, we need to get up to the regulators. We can have the conversations with the utilities, but I think the customers need to become more involved and really address the regulators directly and insist upon some of these changes that make it simpler for us, a greater number of us, to do the things we want to do easier.
Great. Dean, I'm going to jump over Mark because I want to come back to him, so take it.
Yeah, I've been chewing on this a little bit, and I think that it brought me back to, if you remember the factories of the past, they would generate their own power. Right. And why would they generate their own power? Because it was critical to their business. Right. And so ultimately what happened is it wasn't cost effective for them to do it. And if you look at what Google's doing, is they're changing the way things are happening. They're putting billions of dollars into it. And if you think about it, there's hundreds of billions of dollars of replication happening right now. We all have generators, UPSs, everything else in our infrastructure because we don't trust the utility to be up. Plain and simple. So to me, it still comes back to, we seem to be reliving history here again. The data centers are basically doing all this extra stuff and investing money. It seems like we should be coming together to figure out how that utility generation is going to work. So I think there's so much money spent on the other side. It should come back together, and we truly could change the grid. We truly could change the way that we're delivering digital services. We may have to come up with a standard unit metric like they did with kilowatt hour.
Leanne.
I'm going to echo many of the things that I think we are all saying, and that is we've changed more in the last 10 years than we did in the 100 before it, and I believe we're going to see even more change in the next 10 years than we've seen in the last. The only way we're going to be successful is if we learn how to partner better. This isn't just about customer service. This is really about understanding how we're going to serve the entire industry and all of our customers, because we have the same customers. We have to find that integration, both in the power delivery as well as in the data delivery, and the utilities need to learn how to leverage the data that is available.
Mark, what did you hear today?
Well, I think I've worked in both worlds. I still work in both worlds. Well, actually, I work in three worlds. I work in the policy world, the data world, and the energy utility. I'd say a key takeaway for me is it's a form of, fish in water don't know they're in water. There's a certain degree of awareness amongst us all, and I include myself, because it's hard to get out of your aquarium. I don't think there's full appreciation of the transformation underway. We say the words, but I think there's an operational reflex that the future will look twice as big as the present, or, it's different, but I'll just go on record as saying the scale of change is coming in terms of the intersection of the two worlds is bigger than being described. And one of the most important changes, we talked a lot about consumer stuff. The consumer stuff is going to be very important, but less important in the future. The data demands and the infrastructure are disappearing into the systems. Once you say IoT or anything else, then that becomes part of the background infrastructure. So you don't have you're not talking about how consumers perceive energy use anymore. We're talking about, to your point, it's an integral part of the infrastructure of the future, to yours, from water and food, to energy, and now to data. They're all integrated. That has an implication to Peter's point and to Dean's point. That's extremely important, and it's the culture clash. So my big takeaway is culture clash, which is not easy to fix, and it's not rooted in attitudes, or they're not innovators or are innovators. As Peter's pointed out, data centers are pushing toward the responsibility, in an engineering sense, back into the grid, because you can. If a server's, put it this way, if a server's free, but power quality and reliability are expensive, build more servers, more data, more storage, and just distribute them around the grid and just chase cheap, reliable power. To your point is that those things push you into that network. That network is not stupid. I've worked with hundreds of utilities. They're not unaware. They have very different responsibilities and very different legal constraints. So language about getting them to change their culture sounds nice. It's great at conferences. I've testified before Congress. I've testified as an expert witness before regulatory proceedings. I will just take a bet with anybody that the pace of change in these two is not going to comfortably intersect, and it's not because the other world is stupid, unaware of innovation. It's because it's now cyber-physical, it's consequential. Once you start affecting lives, operations of businesses, whether you just take down a reservation system, how about you take down a hospital? How about if you take down the entire manufacturing plant? You can go to the water systems. Once these are fully merged into data, the analytics and machine learning, the integral reliability will rise to the demand society has put on the energy systems. That level of resilience, reliability has high inertia, high consequence, non-trivial. I'm not saying we can't. I'm extremely optimistic about figuring out how to do it. I would just say that the culture clash reflects a timing and a velocity pace that has been experienced in data, doing apps, consumer stuff, that cannot be reflected in the inertia of physical systems that involve human lives.
Okay, time for one last comment. Peter, you've got it.
For me, it's extremely interesting to watch the dynamics of this industry. I'm sure you heard these numbers. By 2018, 60% of all IT assets will sit in either colocation or cloud infrastructure systems. 60%. There are over 1,500 data centers in the United States. That's about 40% of the entire data center population around the world. What we see today, we see this very aggressive consolidation. DRT buying DuPont Fabros is the latest example, or look at Equinix buying everybody, including my mother-in-law little garage. It's in 5 years or so, we're going to see probably 30 mega data center owners around the world. And coming back to the issue about supply, I think that the challenge is not supply at the macro level. The problem is the issue of supplying at the local. You look at certain sites in the United States, or could be Ireland, could be UK, many other places where the demands, Switch is a good example. We're requesting 100, 200, even 400 megawatts in a very fast, very flexible manner of delivering. It's very difficult. I mean, it's not that easy to bring 400 megawatts within the next year and a half to a certain site. So because of that, it's an interesting thing for me to see the advent of distributed generation. And, there are other factors, Katrina or Sandy or, cyber threats, San Onofre or Fukushima. There are many other factors that are driving this new distributed power structure where we see large CHP facilities, primarily gas-driven engines, or other source of power. But the mega data centers and the on-site generation, I think, are going to go hand in hand as we progress in this business.
Okay, we're going to wrap this panel on that note. Thank you very much. It's been very thought-provoking. Thank you.